Hi, welcome to Speducated. I am your hostess, Christy White. Today we're talking about how to plot your child's Battelle scores onto a normal curve and why you might want to do that. In order to get the most from this screencast, I recommend that you have two items at your fingertips. The first is a copy of your child's Battelle report with scores, if you have that. And second, and this may take a few minutes, so feel free to hit pause on the video here, I want to invite you to grab a pencil and a blank piece of paper and go ahead and sketch out a normal curve like the one you see on your screen. And don't worry about making it perfect. Nobody else has to see this except you. As you may know, a normal curve is just a visual way to say a bunch of kids the same age took this test, and most of their scores fell right here in the middle. Some fell above that or below that, and very few fell into these tails at either end. One of the main benefits of using a normal curve is that it can help you understand your child's strengths and areas of need in relation to other kids his or her age. If you look across this top row here, these are called standard scores, and that's what that SS stands for on the left. And in Battelle land, they're called developmental quotients, and there's one for each developmental area or domain. I'd like to switch views here just briefly to give you a quick overview of the domains and subdomains on the Battelle. Here they are. So we have our 5 major domains: cognition, motor, communication, adaptive, and personal social. And I want to mention here that the developmental quotient for each major domain area is a composite score that's based on the scores from each subtest. And because each subtest is also going to have its own standard score, we can also plot subtests on our normal curve today. So let's go back to our normal curve. I'm just going to fade this out, and I'll point out that the subdomain test scores correlate with this bottom row right here, and the ST stands for subtest or subdomain. Before we plot scores, it's helpful to know that most educational testing has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Let's break that down a little bit. Why don't we run through a quick example of how to calculate the mean average in a small data set, as well as how to get a standard deviation. So I'm just going to put mean. Let's say we have a data set of a 1, a 2, a 3, a 3, and a 6. In order to get the mean average of this data set, and by the way, let's imagine that each one of these numbers represents a test score from a child on a given test. So we're going to add these up and divide by the number of scores, right? So adding these up together, we get 15, and then we're going to divide by the number of scores, which is 5, and we'll get 3, and that's our mean average right there. In order to calculate the standard deviation of this data set, we're going to do the following. And standard deviation is really just a description of how spread out the data are. So in order to calculate that, we're going to identify each score's distance from the mean. So let's go ahead and start with the first digit, which is a 1. How far from 3 is 1? 2, right? 1, 2. How far from 3 is 2? 1. Oh, I should be putting plus signs here. How far is 3 from 3? 0, and another 0. How far from 3 is 6? 3. And we're going to add these up and divide by 5. So we've got 3 plus 3 is 6. Divided by 5 gives us 1.2. And if you look at this data set, 1.2 makes sense as a standard deviation or as an average distance from the mean, because these two digits are 1 apart from each other. These two digits are 1 away from each other. There's a 0 and a 0. And then we've got a 3 over here. So it kind of makes sense that the standard deviation of this population is 1 and some change. So we've got our standard deviation right there, 1.2. So now that we have a handle on the mean and the standard deviation, let's return to the normal curve to talk about standard scores. And I promise this is the last big concept that I'm going to tell you about before we start plotting some scores. So the standard score is a value that the test manufacturer assigns to each possible raw score on a given test based on a standard scale. And what this allows us to do is locate an individual score somewhere on our normal curve here in relation to the population as a whole, using the concept of the mean and the standard deviation. Alright, enough of my blappity blappin'. Let's plot some scores. And you may want to plot your own child's scores as we go here. I've got an example, and I'll write in the developmental quotients for each area. We've got a cognitive score of 75, communication an 83, for motor a 113, personal social 114, and adaptive is 136. And I'm just going to take these scores now for each domain and plot them on the normal curve. So we'll start with cognition. We've got a 75, and I'll put him about right there. And then we've got an 83 for communication. Let's put that one right there. Motor is a 113, maybe right there. And personal social, kind of next to it. And then we've got adaptive way out here at 136. And let's try putting these scores in a little bit of context here. I don't know what real statisticians think about, but when I look at a normal curve, I imagine 100 kids lined up, and each one of their scores on this same test is represented somewhere on this normal curve. As a matter of fact, 68% of those scores fall either one standard deviation above the mean or one standard deviation below the mean. So we'll just put 68% right there. And about, well, not about, but 50% of our scores fall between a standard score of 90 and 110. So that's helpful to keep in mind as you're putting these scores in context. Another thing I want to point out is the category labels up here. This A stands for average, and I want to caution you not to put too much weight on these labels, because there's really no universal labeling system for categories. Each test publisher kind of creates their own, and they're somewhat arbitrary. But I just want to point out what they are in case you hear them in a meeting, or if you see them referenced in your child's report, you'll know what they're referring to. So I'm going to go and excuse me 1 second while I just change views here. and we'll take a look at what the Battelle defines for each category. So each category has a range of standard scores, and so if your child falls into that standard score, then they fall into that category according to the Battelle. So according to the Battelle, an average score is between 90 and 110, and I'll tell you that's very standard across the board on many different tests, because that's where 50% of the scores will fall on a normal curve with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. And then down here we've got a low average between 80 and 89, mild developmental delay between 70 and 79, and significant developmental delay between 45 and 69. Over here on the right, we've got the high average category falling between 110 and 119, advanced 120 and 129, and accelerated goes between 130 and 155. Let's go back to our example scores now, and we'll take a look at the middle row down here. This is the percentile row. Let's get our scores back in here. There we go. This middle row, we have an idea of what the standard scores are, the category labels, the standard deviations, and the mean. This middle row here is called percentiles, and each one of these scores you can easily see where they fall in terms of its percentile rank using this row. So for instance, let's just look right here in the middle. This says 50. I don't know if you can read my handwriting. Ever since, I don't know about you, ever since I started keyboarding, my handwriting has just plummeted. If we had a score, a standard score of 100, and this is just an example here, then that would correspond to a percentile rank of 50. So again, we've got our 100 children lined up, and this score of 100 tells us that it's higher than 50 other scores, the same as or higher than 50 other scores. So a percentile rank of 84 is going to tell us that that score is higher than 84 children's scores on this curve. So that just gives you an additional reference. Sometimes you'll get a percentile rank without a standard score, or vice versa, or sometimes you'll get your scores as age equivalents or grade equivalents. If you get age or grade equivalents, that's great, but I would go ahead and call the school and ask if they would be willing to report the data as standard scores and percentile ranks, because that's really what you need in order to put your child's scores into context. Getting back to this child's scores, we've got two scores here and here. We've got a motor score and a personal social score that are almost a standard deviation above the mean, and they are slightly above average. And we've got an adaptive score that's way above the mean, more than 2 standard deviations above the mean at a standard score of 136. Down here on the other side, we've got a communication score of 83 and a cognitive score of 75. Both of these scores are more than a standard deviation below the mean. The cognitive score is almost 2 standard deviations below the mean. As a parent, I'm going to want to make a note of these 2 scores, and these are scores that I'm going to want to at least bring up for conversation at my team meeting, and get some more information around those scores, and hear what the examiners have to say about maybe why my child scored in that range, what we can attribute that to. Sometimes with young children, especially if they're walking into a test site for the first time and they don't really have a rapport or a comfort level with the people and the setting yet, kids can be very shy. And, you know, sometimes they aren't always able to show what it is they know. And that's why it makes it so important that you're you're giving information and input as the parent with regard to what you're seeing at home, what you're seeing with friends, and that the team is consulting all different kinds of data and drawing on different different types of both testing, observation, parent report, teacher report, so that we can really get a good handle on where a particular child is. Um, and so just keep in mind, quantitative test scores are just one type of data that your team will consider when they're looking at eligibility or whether or not a child needs services. But I'm definitely going to make a note of these two scores, anything more than a standard deviation below the mean, and at least bring it up for conversation uh, and possibly for consideration of eligibility for services and specific services. One last thing that I want to make a point of and mention is, and we haven't done this here, but you can do this on your own, is use this bottom row here for your subtest scores. So the subtests will have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3 points either way. So if you have a subtest score or a subdomain score of 7, you know that's one standard deviation below the mean. And if you've got a subtest score of 13, that's a standard deviation above the mean. So you can go ahead and plot your subscores as well. So while we can't sit here and say this child needs X, speech therapy or physical therapy, without knowing anything else about him or her, I do want to leave you with some final thoughts to consider as you're trying to understand your own child's test scores. So, when I'm looking at these scores, the question I'm going to ask myself first is how far above or below the mean is each individual domain score? And if you decide to bring it up for discussion at your team meeting, and you can certainly talk about it in relation to standard deviations, one thing I would consider is talking about a particular score as a percentile rank. Sometimes that can just be a whole lot more compelling than talking about standard deviations. For instance, this score down here of 75. Let's take a look at that as a percentile rank. So I'm just going to make a wild guess here. I didn't actually look this up on the chart, but I'm going to take a guess that that's going to come in at a percentile rank of about 5. And another way to say this is if we had our 100 children lined up in a row here, this score is higher or the same as 5 children's scores. So to me, that's pretty compelling. I imagine that there could be people on your team who would hear that information and feel the same way.